Serta to come back to basically answer questions and to talk about. I mean, I know they specifically talked about pilots and solar and so on the last time. This is if they had any more information they could share, and if we have any questions of them. As you know, this is something that's popping up all over the county in terms of solar, and the issue of pilots is being discussed. So I just think the more education we can get as supervisors, the better off we'll be. So Mike or Rob, do you have anything to add?
No, I'm good.
Or Suzette?
No, I'm good. We're just glad to have Ian and his team back. They did a great job last time, and I'm looking forward to their update today.
Well, this time you just have Ian, no team. So hopefully I still live up to the bar that my teammates set. But yeah, thank you guys for having me back. I'm happy to be here.
Okay. So Ian, do you have any more information to impart, or?
Sure. Yeah. Give me just a second, and I am happy to share my screen. Give me just a brief moment. I think I should be able to do that. Are you guys seeing my screen at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, so I did put together another slideshow, but like last time, I want this to be, as productive as possible for you and all of the board. And so I'm happy to stick to, the presentation I put together. I'm happy to throw it out completely and just do an hour of Q&A. I really am happy to accommodate whatever everybody is interested in talking about tonight. As a reminder, yeah, my name is Ian Latimer. I'm from the Clean Energy Siting team at NYSERDA, which exists at sort of the nexus between, public policy and working with local governments and communities across the state. So we put together resources regarding clean energy and kind of proliferate those across the state however we can. So happy to help communities with zoning laws, questions about pilot and seeker, things like that. So as far as like what I had discussed or what I had set up to talk about this evening, I have a few different topics. A quick recap of some of what we covered last time about Real Property Tax Law 47 and the issue of pilots. A little bit of information regarding solar zoning and things that NYSERDA thinks are particularly important to make sure that you have covered in your solar zoning law. Sort of included in that are two spotlights I wanted to call out, which are the issues of solar on agricultural lands and fire safety for solar systems. And then I thought it might be useful to talk a little bit about the new siting process for large-scale renewables in New York State. It's known as the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, or ORES, also known as 94C. So those are the topics that I had set aside to spend some time talking about this evening. But like I said, I'm happy to be flexible. So if there's anything in here that doesn't seem of interest or maybe does seem particularly of interest, I'm happy to allocate time as we need. So maybe I'll pause real quick before we get into everything and just give you guys a chance to see if this agenda looks good or if there's any changes that you'd like to make, and maybe we can spend our time better elsewhere.
Ian, I have a question. I'm sure it's been asked before, but I don't know the answer yet. And that is that on the pilot program, if we do the pilot program, does that opt out? Okay. Does that hurt us as far as somebody who puts a rooftop unit or in their own personal yard or something? Will that stop them from getting any kind of tax, breaks or anything like that?
Yeah, and so I can maybe just jump right into the pilot stuff because that question is addressed here. So like you hinted at, just within that question alone, we learned a few things about Real Property Tax Law 47, right? So we know that the exemption is formatted as an opt-out exemption, meaning your municipality does offer the tax exemption for solar systems and other renewable energy technologies until you've passed a law or resolution opting out. Now, to your specific question, the exemption is uniform, meaning it applies to all system sizes. So based on the way real property tax law 487 is written, you cannot opt out solely to tax certain types or classifications of projects. It applies to all systems, which means if you opt out, you're going to be able to assess and tax a large scale or community solar project at full value, but it also means that any residential or commercial system will also not receive the tax exemption.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Just to backtrack one, just reminding everybody, you can visit our website, Clean Energy Siting Team. It's nyserda.ny.gov/siting. We've got all of our resources. They live here. So if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out through our website or my email, which is later in the presentation. And you can also access our solar guidebook, our energy storage guidebook, and our wind energy guidebook on this page as well.
So
but back to the good stuff.
If you do want to opt out, you have to do a public hearing, correct? If you're a municipality?
Yeah, well, so if you want to opt out,
law, I should say.
It's a local law, exactly. Yeah, so you'll file it and process it the same way you would any local law, subject to the public hearing requirements established under municipal law in New York State. The only thing that's particularly different with a pilot law versus any other piece of legislation is some of the filing procedures. And so what you want to make sure you do if you do pass a local law opting out, you want to make sure that you file that with the Department of Tax and Finance as well as NYSERDA. And that's actually written into the law that you have to file it with both agencies for the opt-out to be effective. So you want to make sure that you do that if you're going to pass the opt-out law.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And then currently...
Sorry, this is Suzette.
Yeah?
I just wanted to add real quick that you don't have to opt out in order to do the pilot. You wouldn't be opting out in order to do a pilot.
No, I understand. If you
Yes,
opt out,
okay.
that means you're not going to do a pilot, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I do have some information about that here. Yeah, so municipalities that have not opted out can enter pilot agreements. There's some information here about sort of the purposes of pilots. You know, it allows you to capture the revenue that you would have missed under RPTL 487. This is all kind of material that we went over last time, so I'm happy to run through it real quick, or we can just keep doing questions. It seems like, you know, you guys may have a pretty good grasp on that. But yeah, so you're correct. So if you are to opt out, you just want to make sure you file the law with NYSERDA and Tax and Finance. Currently, NYSERDA is sort of revamping the way we our filing process for pilot opt-outs. And so soon we hope to have a more formal filing mechanism on our website using a different program. In the meantime, until that's up and running, I'm happy to process opt-outs. If you want to just send them my way, you can send them via email to me and I can just give you a receipt of confirmation there. I know I've done that for at least one of the school districts in the county, the Taconic Hills School District. I helped them get their opt-out filed earlier this year, or you can send a hard copy to NYSERDA and we can process it that way. So I will be back in touch when we have the opt-out filing thing up to date, but until then, feel free to reach out to me. So we kind of covered this stuff. I don't know if you guys are feeling that maybe some more Q&A on the topic would be helpful. Otherwise, we can maybe keep going. Anyone have any qualms?
I would keep going.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I maybe won't spend too much more time on pilots, other than to say that, again, the idea behind a well-negotiated pilot is that we're striking the right balance here between, you know, allowing jurisdictions to feel and benefit from the financial and economic benefits that the project can bring to a community, while also making sure that that project remains financially viable for the project developer. Supplementing pilots, and this is something that I think we can always all use a reminder of, are what are known as host community agreements or host community benefit packages, which are supplemental to pilots. They're not in lieu of pilots, and they're not completely separate either. So a host community agreement is essentially going to allow the community hosting the project, so in most cases the municipality, be it a city, town, or village, it's going to allow them to realize additional financial or other benefits that they might not get under a pilot. Now, a pilot is usually pretty strictly divided according to either an IDA's pilot policy or the traditional property tax allotments, whereby the taxing jurisdiction, the town, might get the smallest portion of the pilot payment. So the largest slice of the pie might be going to the school district, followed by the county, followed by the town. And an HCA is a really good way of supplementing that to ensure that the town is receiving, adequate benefits, given that it is the town that's the one responsible for things like permitting projects or inspecting projects or, conducting all of the meetings associated with, again, permitting or inspecting projects. And HCAs can take a number of different forms. I've seen them be upfront, year one cash payments that supply additional revenue to the town. I've seen them be, commitments to infrastructure investments. Maybe the town has pet projects that they've been trying to raise money for. So it could be a payment directly towards an infrastructure investment. Along those lines, sometimes they're allocated as local improvement projects or even equipment and other purchases. So I've seen them be, purchasing equipment for the traffic or the highway department, purchasing equipment for local fire departments, things like that. So it's often not one of those things. It can be a combination of those, but there is flexibility within HCAs that can be negotiated based on conversations between the town and the developer. A lot of the time, an HCA will be negotiated in conjunction or concurrently with the pilot. There's no set way that you need to negotiate an HCA, but a lot of the times that conversation is related. And like I said before, sometimes they're paid up front in year one, unlike pilot payments, which are annualized. Every year they pay X dollar amount per megawatt. An HCA may be a bit more fluid, can be paid all up front in year one. It's not always tied directly to the size and scale of the project on a megawatt basis. But again, room for negotiation. And the other thing I just want to make sure that we hit on is the Department of Public Service is currently engaged in a proceeding to establish a statewide host community benefit program for large-scale projects. And what that means is that they're trying to find an optimal way to ensure that large-scale projects can provide a financial and economic benefit to all residential utility customers in the host municipality. The reason they're doing that is sort of in response to, I think, the sentiment in some towns across the state that maybe, not everyone in the town gets to benefit from a project. And I think that in response to that, this seems like a pretty logical way of providing, an incremental economic benefit to everyone, even if they're located across town, miles from the project, and it may not actually impact them on the day-to-day. It's a good way of, having some good faith to the community hosting the project. And you can follow along with the proceeding at the link here, which I'm happy to send in the slides after. Essentially, what you should know that as of now, Department of Public Service staff have essentially provided a draft of what the host community benefit program would look like. And what that amounts to in the draft form is $500 per megawatt for utility scale solar projects and $1,000 per megawatt for utility scale wind projects, which is to be added up and divided amongst all utility residential customers in the town. So it's not to say that per capita everyone gets X dollars, but it's per residential utility customer in the town. They would get, that money would be divided up and credited to your utility bill on an annual basis for the first 10 years. So depending on the size of the project and depending on the number of residential customers in the town, you'll be seeing, like I said, an annualized for the first 10 years credit to your utility bill that will defray your electricity costs for the year. So you can follow along with the proceeding at that link, like I said, and I know I'm certainly looking forward to seeing, comments from stakeholders as well as communities across the state. We're really trying to get the word out to make sure that everyone can weigh in and have their voices heard. So I would encourage you to, if you're interested, give it a read and feel free to participate. That will not be the only call to participation I will issue tonight, I promise. So now I was going to go ahead and spend a few minutes focused on solar zoning. And what I mean by that is provisions that we would recommend you focus on or include in your local law if you haven't already. I'm willing to bet that, a number of municipalities in the county probably already have solar laws that they work very hard on to adopt. And so I don't need this to be too duplicative. So if you feel this isn't the best use of time, please do let me know, interrupt me. But
I think our biggest concern, Ian, is that even though we've adopted these, we're told now that they don't mean anything, that the state doesn't have to pay any attention to any of these regulations that a lot of us work very hard to develop. Is that a true statement, whether it's Article 10 or the 94C process?
It's a very good question. So I would not go so far as to say that the local laws don't matter. And I definitely will touch on that a bit later when we get to the large scale siting. And I can kind of breeze through this zoning part if that would be of interest. But essentially, and we'll talk about this in a bit, there are multiple instances in both the Article 10 and ORES processes where substantive consultation with local law needs to be documented, especially in the new ORES process. There are very clear places that the new regulations call for consultation with the local law, which needs to be documented and provided to the office. And that is used in adjudicating how the office either subscribes to or chooses to override certain provisions in a local law. So I personally would not agree with the statement that it doesn't matter. I do understand the sentiment, and I do think that it's, if anything, it's worthwhile to ensure that your local law is very robust and covers all the bases, that you have something to point to in defending it, either to the siting process or if something were to happen and a town were to litigate a award decision or a permit decision. I think a very strong local law is really what you're going to want to be able to point to, which is why it's important to, maybe reevaluate depending on when you passed your local law and when you've updated it, things like that. So with that said, maybe I'll take just.
Ian, what's the standard for when the state can override or disregard the local law in 94C?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm sorry, I don't have when I'm in presenter mode, I cannot see who's speaking, but it's a really good question. And by my understanding, one of the sort of fundamental differences between the new siting process and the ORES process versus the Article 10 process is that the standard to which things are found to be overly burdensome or unduly burdensome, I believe that's sort of what's changed, right? So I believe the new ORES process, the standard for unduly burdensome is in reflection of the state's energy goals under the CLCPA. So since that was passed in law in 2019, that established and codified in law that New York State needs to meet 70% by 2030 renewable goals and 100% clean energy goals by 2040. So I believe that is the new standard to which things are held as far as deeming them unduly burdensome or not. So essentially, if ORES finds that a particular standard is going to inhibit the state's ability to push towards that 70 by 2030 goal, that may be bounds enough to deem something as unduly burdensome. And I do want to note that the regulations and standard permit conditions from ORES are publicly available online, and the public hearings for those are actually beginning tonight and will occur throughout the next week. And that was my sort of other call to action. So I'm happy to go into that a little bit tonight, but I also would highly recommend that anyone who's interested and or wants to make a statement regarding ORES, your chance to do that is sort of this week. And I'm happy to walk through where you can find that information a bit later in the presentation.
Aren't comments going to be accepted through December 7th?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so comments will be accepted through December 7th. The public hearings are occurring tonight through end of November. A number of those are virtual, so you don't actually have to be there in person for obvious reasons. But if you want to actually speak at the public hearing and share your comments verbally, you do have to register ahead of time, ahead of the hearing. And again, I can point out where that is online later in the presentation. But yes, you're right that December 7th is the deadline for written comments.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. So would it be worth me to continue going into the zoning piece, or should I maybe jump ahead to the large-scale renewables piece? Anyone have a preference?
To hear more about the solar installations in agricultural districts, as much of Columbia County is an agricultural area, and I think that's the bigger concern for many of us in our local zoning, that it didn't affect, our agricultural operations.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, then maybe I can just sort of gloss through a couple of quick slides here. So just base level, our model solar law recommends, obviously, treating different projects differently based on size. So we have 3 tiers in our law, which correspond with different requirements across the state for interconnection and permitting. So tier 1 is going to be your rooftop and commercial and residential rooftop systems. Tier 2 is going to be small scale residential ground mount systems. And tier 3 is going to be anything larger. Tier 3 is where you start dealing with things like site plan review and special use permits. So some of the important things to keep in mind when you're permitting these larger systems are where projects are even feasible. So we always recommend that people at least take a look at the utility hosting capacity maps, which can give you an idea of where projects may crop up in the future in that community solar scale size. So anywhere from like 2 to 5 megawatts, that's where you'll see where those projects may be able to pop up in the future. You can also look at transmission lines, transmission mapping, which can give you an idea potentially of where you'd see larger scale projects, which interconnect to the higher capacity lines. Based on that, you'll want to identify zones where systems are practicable and will be allowed. We recommend, again, utilizing a special use permit and site plan review processes. The reason we have that is so that you can establish very clear standards for your site plan review and for your special use permit approvals. So we're talking about things like making sure upfront applicants are able to present, any proposed landscape changes that are needed, as well as vegetation and operation and maintenance plans. Comprehensive diagrams that show you project design as well as the electrical components. And then for establishing standards for special use permits, you'll have things like bulk and area restrictions and agricultural impacts and things like that. So we'll definitely get into that. I know that that's where the interest is. Real quick, I do want to hit on decommissioning, because decommissioning I think is often a pretty important part of the local zoning plan that you'll want to make sure you have built out. So you want to make sure that your decommissioning plans clarify the timeframes or inactivity that would trigger decommissioning, so that these systems aren't going to be sitting around for a long time. If something were to happen to the company, there's insolvency or something happens, you don't want these systems sitting there years after they've stopped producing electricity. You also want to make sure that you're requiring a robust decommissioning plan, outlining all the costs, timelines, and activities involved in decommissioning the system. And you want to detail requirements for a decommissioning surety. So whether your community is comfortable with a cash escrow account or a letter of credit or a bond or some other financial instrument, you want to make sure that you very clearly detail what will be required for that instrument. And there's a few things that we recommend. So number one, you want to make sure it covers the full cost of system removal. And we recommend not including salvage values in that. In my opinion, anything that the developer can get for their scrap metal and or reselling the panels, that's great, but it should not fall on the town to, potentially be subject to that, given that those are not fixed costs, and we really don't know that at this point. We can't predict the market for resale. So we definitely make sure that you don't have that in there. Another question that we get a lot is on the subject of prevailing wage for decommissioning bonds. My personal feeling is that prevailing wage should be included in decommissioning bond estimates. Because in my mind, the point of a decommissioning bond is to ensure that, if push came to shove and the town was stuck footing the bill for a system decommissioning, you want to make sure that the town, which is subject to prevailing wage requirements, has what it needs to remove the system safely and in a not, extremely expensive way. So I would recommend that you consider that, or at least bring that into the, into the picture when you're discussing decommissioning bonds with companies. It's also recommended that you either, have an annual escalator on the decommissioning bond, or revisit it on a regular basis to account for inflation and changing project costs. It also, like I said, will cover the municipality in the event of anything like a project sale. You want to make sure that the bond is going to be transferable between companies, so that you're not left having to renegotiate a decommissioning bond in the event of a sale or something like that. It also protects against insolvency or any other circumstances whereby an applicant would be unable to remove the system after a certain time. Real quick, special use permit standards. Our model law recommends either utilizing underlying zoning requirements or establishing district-specific parcels or parcel requirements. So that comes into terms with things like minimum acreage or system height or parcel line setbacks. One thing that we don't include in our model law currently, which I am looking into adding into our model law based on what I would consider best practices, is not only doing parcel line setbacks, but potentially also doing non-participating residence setbacks. We've seen this a lot with mostly wind projects, but I would consider it relevant to solar as well, which is just to say that especially in more rural areas where the lots can be pretty large. Parcel line setbacks are one thing, and it's all well and good, but it doesn't actually tell you the distance that you'll be away from the non-participating resident. So we're considering, looking at adding additional standards for non-participating residences, which is something that will be factored in to the new ORES special use permit, ORES permit standards. They do include separate setbacks for non-participating residents and parcel lines, and I think that that's a good idea. Continuing on, so for screening and visibility, our model law, my apologies. Our model law recommends treating these large-scale projects similar to how you treat secret projects. So essentially that 10-acre threshold whereby a project would become a type 1 action, which would require, much more robust analyses and studies. We sort of think that that's a pretty fair standard to build into your model law as well. So for our model law, projects above the 10-acre threshold are required to do, more robust assessments and visual modeling to understand the visual impacts and screening requirements. Whereas projects under that threshold may not require the same detail based on the size of the project. And the pictures here can sort of give you an idea of projects in the Northeast that have, pretty robust screening. The one on the left, I would say, is just an example of a really well-sited project, given that it didn't require that much clearing because it was already mostly vacant land, and there's natural screening that's occurring on almost all of the project. The one at the right, you can see an example of, type of tree planting that would be pretty standard for a community solar scale project. You just want to make sure that you're requiring adequate year-round evergreen coverage to make sure that visual impacts are mitigated. And frankly, I think that at the end of the day, I think screening and visibility are one of the primary concerns in a lot of places around the state. So I think really being, very attentive to what you're going to require in your local law on the subject is pretty important. Now, agricultural resources. So, we had identified this as an area that we want to spend some time on. So we will do that now. So as far as special use permit standards in the model law, we recommend including a few things regarding agricultural resources. So that can be, using a specific strategy to implement acreage or lot coverage restrictions for certain priority soils. So the first example on the right would be that, where you essentially demarcate that certain areas, whether it's prime farmland or farmland of statewide importance or prime if drained soils, any of those, you can implement specific lot coverage requirements that cap the amount of land that can be used if it consists of those soils. You can also include impact mitigation strategies, such as seeding parcels with pollinator-friendly or native vegetation. So that's included there as well, down below at number 3. So, we talk about doing that to the extent practical, which is always good language to build in just because it gives you flexibility based on site-specific considerations. You can also require applicants to propose a vegetation management plan to ensure implementation and upkeep of vegetation and biodiversity on the land. So that's a big concern that a lot of people have. We don't want to make this land, take it out of production and leave it just sitting there doing nothing. So it's nice to be able to at least, if you're not going to pursue agricultural co-location, which we'll talk more about in a moment, you can at least include, pollinator-friendly or natural species there. It's also important that we want to adhere to the New York State Department of Ag and Markets construction guidelines. So they've got construction guidelines for both wind and solar projects, which are pretty comprehensive. They address everything from early stage construction activities to system decommissioning. So we recommend including in your local law that projects adhere to the extent practicable to the Department of Ag and Markets mitigation guidelines. Obviously, they are the experts as far as impacts on agricultural land. So I think it's really great that they put these together, and I think it's highly recommended that people consider including this for large projects in the community. And finally, and this is something that again is not currently in our model law, but we are looking at adding into based on what we're seeing around the state. You can also encourage applicants to utilize site-appropriate solar co-location or dual-use strategies. And what we mean when we talk about that are a few things that are probably somewhat familiar to you guys. So let me skip ahead and we'll come back to that slide. So a couple of types of dual use and co-location are things like solar grazing, which you see on the top left of the images here. Solar grazing is getting pretty popular all across New York State, if not all across the country. We're actually really fortunate to have an organization called the American Solar Grazers Association based out of New York State, which is showing that there's a whole industry to be built around solar that is co-locating with agriculture. It doesn't have to be competing uses. At the right is something called Geneva Peeps, which is a small scale free-range chicken and egg co-op in Geneva. They've recently, in the last couple of years, they've implemented a solar array on the site under which the chickens roost and hang out all day, being happy chickens, not getting eaten by avian predators because they're under the panels. And that's just another pretty interesting dual use. I don't think that that is scalable to large scale projects quite the same way at this point, but who knows in the future, I could be wrong. Another option would be on-site or proximal beekeeping. So we see that often paired with pollinator-friendly plantings. So that's a good way of, I think it's a cool way of showing at things like farmers markets or local markets. You can show the impact that the solar farm is making on bees in the area, and it's great for existing agricultural uses in the area as well, given the importance of preserving and allowing pollinators to flourish. And the final option is what we're sort of hearing called agrivoltaics, which is the idea of crop cultivation in and around panels. Now, at this point, that's also something that it's pretty early stage in the research phases across the country. We're only seeing really good results from those research phases, but it's not yet scalable at the large scale level the way maybe some of these largest projects we're seeing in New York are. I do know there's at least one project that's going through the Article 10 process that has incorporated active agriculturally farmed parcels on the project area alongside the arrays, which I think is really wonderful. And it's a good way of ensuring that the land is not fully going out of production. So that's definitely something that is potentially negotiable if and when projects are proposed in the community.
I have a question on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So
no,
if you have the solar panels, in place, and then in between them, like you say, there's that green space where you could farm in between them. So if a town is setting a density, a factor on a piece of property, does that agricultural land then all of a sudden come into play, or doesn't it? Is there any laws on that at this point governing that? So
just to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So you're saying, so if you're going to have like a lot coverage requirement that's going to cap, the amount of space covered by panels on the site, are you asking if the farmed area would be included in the lot coverage calculation?
Yeah. Yes, that's what I'm asking.
So, yeah, it's a great question, and I think that there's not really a state level approved definition of lot coverage. So my guess is that no, you probably wouldn't want to include the agriculturally farmed land in the lot coverage calculation. So it's kind of an interesting school of thought because generally speaking in land use practice, lot coverage is based on what they call like impermeable surfaces. So you're looking at the impact to things like stormwater runoff based on the amount of land that you're making impermeable to water, right? And solar has kind of challenged that definition of lot coverage because the impermeable surface, as far as where it's actually meeting the land, is extremely minimal. It's steel piles that are driven into the ground that are just a couple inches around. So it doesn't really make sense to have that be the sole calculation. There are concrete pads that things like inverters and energy storage systems are usually mounted on, which makes sense to include in lot coverage calculations. But a lot of the time what we end up seeing is it's less about lot coverage and more about the general footprint of the project, right? So some people choose to calculate that based on the square footage of the panels. Some people choose to calculate it based on the fenced-in area. My personal sentiment is that you really just need to hone in on what it is that you're trying to accomplish with a lot coverage maximum, right? Because if it's, if you're worried about things like impermeable surfaces, it's, any type of boundary that you set for lot coverage is probably not going to be met because there's so little impermeable surface on these projects that that's not really the accurate methodology for calculation. So my personal take is that I think it's a more reasonable calculation to think about like the square footage of the panels or the ground covered by the panels if you want to impose something like that. But I would personally not recommend including the area between the panels necessarily, especially if you're looking at doing some type of agricultural co-location.
Yeah, we've run into a bit of an issue with that, like in our town, because we have a density requirement, on a parcel. And now that they want to go ahead and farm through the middle of them, they're saying, well, that doesn't count. So in turn, we wound up with a lot more solar panels, on that piece of property. So,
that's because Why would it be more panels? Maybe I don't understand.
Well, they're
that.
using a density requirement. The way we wrote it, we didn't calculate for them wanting to farm through the middle of it. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So what happens is that, now that they're farming through the middle of it, they're taking that area that they're farming out of the calculation. You see what I'm saying here? So that then it makes,
sure.
It turns it into a larger project in a way, as far as.
So it's not necessarily that they're adding more panels, it's that they're adding to the project area by spacing things out more. Is that sort of what you're
and indirectly using it to increase our density a little bit, on a particular parcel, So
I think.
Go ahead.
Oh, go for it, please.
No. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, a sort of related question, and this is something that I've seen come up a few times. That I think I'm personally, again, I keep saying there are things I'm looking to add to our model law. In case you haven't understood, this is it's a fluid situation, and we're all kind of learning here. And I think one thing that I'm looking to add here with regard to lot coverage is, excuse me, I've seen the issue come up a few times with projects consisting of multiple parcels, whether it's one landowner or multiple landowners. Things like lot coverage restrictions, if you have a relatively low lot coverage percentage, can lead to sort of fragmented or spaced out project areas, which again, I think it sort of comes back to, why, what you're trying to get at when you set a lot coverage maximum. Because if you're just trying to, prevent a sort of like large mass of panels in one specific area, then actually what you could in effect be doing by having a low lot coverage percentage is causing that project to kind of like striate out, because they have to secure more land in order to reach a certain size based on, their optimal size in order for the project to be economical. And so, potentially what could maybe be done about that is, if you had a project that was crossing multiple parcels, again, whether it's one landowner or multiple, you could consider applying, a lot coverage percentage to the full project area rather than individual parcels, which may lead to some flexibility in terms of where you're able to site the project, because they could maybe site it a bit more densely, but have it in a certain area where it's less visually obtrusive or intrusive rather to the community. So I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm absolutely happy to continue that dialogue with you. And if anyone has thoughts about the suggestion I just sort of made, it's something that I'm kind of workshopping, so I'm very open to feedback. Hopefully that explanation kind of makes sense, but if it doesn't, let me know, and please do feel free to give me your thoughts on that.
Okay. You can continue on. I mean, I'm okay with that at this point.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no problem. So I'm actually going to go back a little bit in the solar on agricultural land section.
Ian, I have a quick question. Sorry, this is Suzette. Do you know how this impacts an agricultural exemption? Can they still apply for an ag exemption? I know you're working with ag and markets, or do you have any input on that?
Yeah, so the ag assessment program is actually mostly kind of run through the Department of Tax and Finance-ish. It's kind of both, but as far as the calculation of assessment stuff, we're dealing a bit more with the Tax and Finance Department. So generally speaking, there's kind of only one exception by which solar on agricultural land will not cause a conversion. Generally speaking, you are looking at a conversion of ag assessment. And so what that means is, for any community solar project or larger scale solar project installed on agricultural land, it's going to trigger a conversion, which you calculate based on the amount of taxes saved in the most recent year, and then include compounding interest based on the number of years it's received that exemption. And that's something that is subject to the local assessor. But we're always happy to give our assistance to coming up with those calculations as well. The only time that I'm aware of in which solar on ag land does not trigger a conversion penalty or payment is when it's specifically calculated or defined as on-farm equipment. And what that means is that it's serving up to 110% of the anticipated electrical load of the farm it's located on. So what that means is whether it's directly powering farm equipment or utilizing like net metering if it's doing one of those two and it's providing power on site, essentially, so you're using it to power the farm, in that situation, it's treated as on-farm equipment, and you can keep the agricultural assessment, and you can also benefit from RPTL 487 unless the town is opted out. So as far as I know, that is the only instance in which you get kind of best of both worlds there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the question of solar on agricultural lands, I think at its root is really rooted in kind of what all zoning is rooted in, and that is the town's comprehensive plan and guiding document. And comp plans often recognize and prioritize definitely agricultural land preservation and activities, but a lot of them also recognize and pursue clean energy, recognizing that, you know, a sustainable way is the way forward for our country and specifically our municipalities, especially recognizing that, you know, we're seeing clean energy touted as a job creator. We're seeing clean energy hubs pop up all around the state, whether that's at various ports along the Hudson or even out in the Finger Lakes. We're getting a lithium-ion battery recycling facility, which is extremely exciting. So it's worth recognizing that, you know, renewable energy does pose meaningful benefits for the future of the town. We're currently working on a comprehensive plan guide related to clean energy. I hope to have that finalized by the end of this year for release in Q1 of 2021. So I will keep you guys posted on that as well. Some specific context that I think is worth keeping in mind as well when talking about, you know, in a comp plan, how clean energy either does or does not relate to agricultural lands. You may or may not know, but American Farmland Trust put together a really robust state-by-state analysis earlier this year, which identifies threats to farmland. It's called Farmland Under Threat. And in doing so, they identify really specific threats to farmland. And in New York State specifically, 78% of the farmland that's been taken out of production in the last 20 years or so has been for low-density residential settlement or urban and highly developed expansion. And AFT also highlights generational challenges. According to their analysis, about a third of New York State farmers are over the age of 65. And they note that the challenges that are associated with that are that a lot of farms cease to be in agricultural production upon you know, passing over of farms between generations. And so those kind of threats, I think, are worth keeping in mind when you think about how solar or other clean energy can be paired with agricultural uses in your community. And through zoning and comp planning, you know, you can strike a balance and demonstrate that solar and ag might not need to be competing interests, or if they are to be pursued in your community, should not be competing interests. I talked about the tax implication part just a moment ago, the conversion payment. One other thing that is of note is what we're now being referred to as agricultural mitigation payments. And this is a relatively new thing. It's going to be for pretty much any project that's participating in a NYSERDA incentive funding program. So whether that's our New York Sun program for distributed solar projects or the large scale renewables program, which funds these large scale projects by REC contracts. So all of those projects moving forward will have to make what are called agricultural mitigation payments based on the amount of prime soils in categories 1 through 4 that they are located on. So essentially any project over 30 acres in the state of New York moving forward will be required to make a payment to an agricultural mitigation fund based on, again, the land, the high quality soils that they're taking out of production. And I'm happy to send, you know, anyone information on that topic if you're interested. It's a relatively new development in the state. And then just something else to keep in mind about solar on agricultural lands, and this is just sort of, you know, solar versus alternative types of development. You know, I think one of the primary things that I hear a lot from communities about solar is how solar is permanently impacting lands or ruining view sheds. And I think that is a very real sentiment, and I think that is a very fair argument to make. The only thing that I would push back on is just, you know, comparing solar versus alternative types of development that you're likely to see based on the economic challenges of farming, you know, barring any very large return or shift in the way the agricultural industry is compensated in this country. You know, it's a viable option. You know, solar and clean energy can provide landowners with diversified and stable incomes, as well as, you know, again, generational viability like that. That's part of the AFT report I was talking about a moment ago. And there's also some additional benefits of solar versus other type of developments whereby, you know, it's pretty well-studied science that if you give farms a break from all of the constant tilling and herbicides and pesticides that we apply to crops, it's really good for soil health. It's really good for watershed health. And all of those things come into play when we're talking about solar. Like I mentioned earlier, the impervious footprint of solar projects is extremely low. The runoff factor from rain on solar projects is minimal. That's also pretty well studied at this point. So there's a lot of long-term benefits that can happen by, you know, treating the land right for 20 or 30 years. And obviously, I recognize that, you know, that doesn't combat the visual impacts. And I think that's really the key part of talking about solar versus other development. You know, people may not have as much of a problem seeing other, you know, houses or housing developments instead of a solar farm. But I think if the argument in good faith is truly to be one about, you know, the impacts on agricultural lands, I think that the answer is pretty clear that solar doesn't have a tremendous agricultural impact as far as, you know, soil health and environmental health. And the study I do want to just talk about real quick is actually regarding the Topaz Solar Farm, which is a really big utility scale solar project out in California. It's in San Luis Obispo County, not too far from where I grew up. And the Topaz Solar Farm is about 550 megawatts, which is a really massive project. To my knowledge, I think the largest project in Columbia County, I think is in the 50 or 60 megawatt range, if I'm recalling correctly. So this is significantly larger than that. And it's on agricultural land that was used to grow, I believe, barley. I don't remember the exact crop. But they utilized a few different techniques when they were designing and how they operate the project. So they use rotational sheep grazing a couple of times a year based on the need. They do native and pollinator-friendly plantings underneath all of the solar panels. And then specifically, it's located in an area that has a number of endangered or important endemic species. And so the project was specifically designed with those species in mind. So they not only created fencing that was designed to allow certain animals through and keep certain animals out, they also built in these wildlife corridors through the project. And one of the primary animals that they were trying to protect here was called the San Joaquin kit fox, which you see at the bottom right, is taking a little nap underneath the panels at the project. So far, they're reporting extremely good results about the, you know, the biological diversity that's on site at the farm. They've said that post-construction and continuing the vegetation has been comparable, if not better, to off-site areas. And they've seen there's, you know, really high reports of animal life at the farm and within the panels. Even you can see there's a jackrabbit over there on the right as well. So, you know, fencing that is designed to not bar animals from making use of the area is really great, and I think something that I would like to see implemented on pretty much every large-scale project based on the environmental needs for the project. So it's pretty cool stuff happening over there. We talked about this. One other thing that I wanted to call out for solar is just the question of fire safety, because I think this is something that comes up quite a bit for solar as well as energy storage. So for solar panels, there is no special equipment that you need to have a volunteer or otherwise fire department show up and pitch in at a solar installation if something were to go wrong. All you really need is specific training. And what that training is really what it's intended to do is to identify key components and know sort of the order of operations when responding to an incident. So the best way of mitigating fire risks is through adherence to New York State codes, of which we are really robust. So we have the National Electric Code, also known as NFPA 70. That's included in all of our uniform code books. So whether it's the fire code, the building code, and the residential code, all of those are up to the most stringent electric codes and have a number of other requirements for solar installations regardless of type. And so if you're installing everything up to code, what that means is that first responders that arrive on site will have clear identification of all the relevant system components that they've been trained on. They'll have protocol for incident management, and they'll have contact information for the system owner or operator if they need to be contacted, or if there's any special circumstances or protocol that needs to be followed. Essentially, at a high level, the best practice for responding is that you shut off all the inverters, you trip all of the AC and DC disconnects, which ensure that no energy is going to be going to the inverters and or going to and from the grid. And then once the system is safely de-energized, you can just use water applied from an adequate distance, ensuring that the system is not electrified. And one other question that's come up related to fire safety, or related to fire rather, I think is the idea that projects propose some type of big onerous burden on existing fire districts or fire companies. And the truth of that is that these projects, even if you're receiving a property tax exemption under 487, or even if you've negotiated a pilot through the IDA, they're still subject to special district taxes. So they are still going to be paying their fair share to ensure that the fire company gets its money for the responsibilities it has. And I have yet to see a developer that wasn't really enthusiastic about ensuring that the local fire departments are trained according to best practices, because at the end of the day, they also don't want their systems to be burning and damaged if something were to go wrong, which they have before. It's not a very common thing, but it definitely has happened. So in my experience, I think developers, just as much as communities, want to make sure that the fire department is adequately trained in the event something could go wrong. So that's that. And now I'm going to take a quick look at time just to check where we are. Well, we're in good shape. Siting for large-scale renewables, talked a little bit about this, but just going to run through some of the ORES stuff. I'll skip the why, because I think that we all probably have a pretty good idea of why large-scale projects are needed. But if you're interested, this is the New York Independent Systems Operator 2020 grid snapshot. It shows you everything from 2019 and how we're doing as far as our adherence to the state's goal of 70% by 2030. As you can see in Columbia County and all the way downstate, so the downstate region, zones F through K, we have a ways to go. We have almost 30% that's zero emissions, and of that, most of that is nuclear. So there is a pretty significant gap that we need to fill through renewable energy. We'll skip that. You guys probably know a bit about Article 10, but I think that our time is probably best spent on the ORES process. I will just note the one thing. So to date, the Article 10 Siting Board has approved 8 projects, and that's approving them through a process that was designed to review and permit all facilities, not just renewable ones. So it's the same process that's going to be going into if there was a new coal or nuclear facility, as you have for a solar or wind facility, which is sort of what led the state to create the new process. But of those 8 projects that they have approved, all of those are wind projects, but that is anticipated to change this week. I think we're expecting that the Article 10 Siting Board is likely to approve their first solar project later this week, and that would be the Mohawk Solar Project. So earlier this year, there was a piece of legislation passed by the legislature called the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act. And this is the act that gives us ORES, as well as NYSERDA's Build Ready program and the State Power Grid Study, which is being conducted by the Public Service Commission, Department of Public Service, to identify opportunities for transmission grid upgrades around the state. So I just wanted to sort of walk a bit through ORES, which we talked about earlier. Just want to make sure that we have an idea of exactly what we're talking about here. So within ORES, it's again the new process for permitting these large-scale projects, and it's applicable to sort of 3 types of projects. Number 1, similar to Article 10, it's going to be any new renewable energy project equal to or larger than 25 megawatts. The second bucket is going to be renewable projects that are between 20 and 25 megawatts, which have the option of opting in to seek a permit through the state level. And finally, existing renewable projects in early stages of Article 10 review have the choice of opting in to the ORES process. I don't know the exact standard of where in the Article 10 process they need to be. My guess is if they've submitted an application, but the application hasn't gone through like the stipulations process, that there is a chance that they can opt into the ORES process, but I do not know the exact timeline. So that's something I'm happy to go digging through the regulations and let you know if that's something that's of interest. And then, yeah, within 1 year of the law being passed back in April, they need to finalize these regulations and uniform conditions. So we're a number of months into that time, but not at the end, which is why it's very important that, again, if you're interested, you take a look at these regulations and conditions and provide your feedback. Like the supervisor said, by December 7th is the written deadline. And I'm happy to guide you through to those regulations. So ores.ny.gov/regulations, that's where you can find the regulations and the permit standard conditions. And then for ores.ny.gov/events, you can find links to all of the virtual and in-person public hearings that are occurring this week through the end of the month, whereby you can tune in. And I'm so sorry to be keeping you all from tonight's hearing, the first one. I know that that's where you'd be otherwise, but thank you for hanging out with me instead. So a couple of key things in the draft regulations, which I just want to point out. So it outlines pretty substantive pre-application activities, which have to occur at various times prior to the submission of an application for a permit. And that's a few different things. Number one, it's substantive consultation with the host municipality, which is documented. So it needs to be an actual meeting whereby they present the host municipality with early stage project documents, including site plans, so that I think one of the things that this is designed to do, which I am all for, is to ensure that the municipality is being engaged earlier on in a meaningful way with an actual idea of what this project might look like. I know that that's been a big issue with Article 10 projects, and that needs to be at least 2 months prior to them actually submitting their application to the new office. Additionally, in tandem with meeting with the host local officials, they also need to meet with all affected community members, also 60 days prior to submitting their application to ORES. And there's additional information about what those meetings look like in the regulations, but essentially it's, again, presenting, even if it's early stage, presenting a real meaningful idea of what this project will look like and the different analyses that are going to happen in order to make sure the project doesn't have significant impacts. There's also a submission to ORES of draft environmental and cultural reports, which is to be filed as early as possible. So that doesn't give a certain day deadline prior to the application being filed. They just want applicants to provide them as much information as early as possible to ensure that they can get a head start on conducting any environmental reviews in tandem with the Department of Environmental Conservation, or any reviews in tandem with the Department of Ag and Markets, things like that. So as early as they can get started on projects, the better in their mind. It also outlines permit requirements or permit application requirements, including a formal application, which is supplemented by 25 detailed exhibits. So each of those exhibits is designed to highlight a certain consideration, whether that's the agricultural mitigation plan or the visual impact assessment, things like that. There is a pretty detailed roster of 25 things that they need to have done for their application to be in good standing. Along with this, sort of lending from the Article 10 process, there's an intervenor funding component, which is $1,000 per megawatt. 75% of that is automatically reserved for local agencies, so like the host municipalities. The other 25% is set aside for qualified intervenors. I don't know exactly what would happen if there are no other qualified intervenors. It's maybe likely that the additional 25% could get allocated to the host municipalities, but I'm not sure exactly how that is to play out. And finally, the draft regulations detail technology-specific requirements, including things like setbacks, height, noise, and other considerations related to siting projects. So quickly walking through the ORES application steps. So essentially, with the context of the previous slide, so we know that the applicant, let's say they've met with the municipality, and they've met with the host community. It's been 60 days. They can now submit their application to ORES. Within 60 days of receiving the application, you're going to hear 60 days a lot here. Within 2 months of receiving the application, ORES needs to decide whether the application is deemed complete or not, based on the quality of the information received in those 25 attachments, essentially. So within 60 days of ORES determining if the application is complete or not, they have to issue a draft permit based on the standards and conditions and any requests for waivers from the uniform standards and conditions as submitted by the applicant. At the 60 days after they've issued the draft permit, there's a whole comment period whereby the municipality and any interested community members can provide feedback. So that's a 60-day comment period. After that, there's an adjudicatory process whereby the Office of Renewable Energy Siting and the administrative law judges will deem whether or not the application is in compliance with not only all of ORES's standards, but also the local laws that are applicable. And based on their compliance with local laws, if they are not deemed compliant with local laws, there's a whole adjudicatory hearing process that is supposed to take place within the municipality. So on your turf, in your community, to go over if and how these projects don't comply with any local standards. And finally, depending on the result of the adjudicatory process, a final permit decision is to be issued. It is within 1 year for most projects, or within 6 months for projects that are sited on brownfields, landfills, and other post-industrial sites. And one other thing I just want to hit on real quick is some opportunities for local engagement that I feel are pretty substantively made clear in the draft regulations. So before a permit application is even filed, the applicant again has to demonstrate that consultation with the host municipality, which is more than they had to do under Article 10 in a pretty meaningful way. I think this will hopefully keep municipalities from being surprised to hear about projects. I think that that's one of the worst things that I encounter is, in my experience, when I come to a town and they don't know anything about the project despite it being in development for a year maybe or 2 years. I think that that's a pretty it's not good practices. It's not being a good partner. And so I think that this will do a good job of addressing that. Municipality is also going to be notified by ORES upon the publishing of the draft permit, and again has that 60 days where they need to provide feedback on the draft permit and its compliance with any local laws, which is why, again, you want to make sure that your local law is very detailed and prescriptive for all of the concerns of the community, because that's your opportunity, your first opportunity for you to really demonstrate to ORES where the project does or does not comply with your local laws. So then later on, after the comment period ends, again, there's the adjudicatory process, where if the municipality did find that the facility is not in compliance with local laws, there's the adjudicatory hearing process again, like I said, that takes place in the host community. And throughout that time, again, there's the intervener funding that is available to municipalities and community organizations to ensure everyone is participating and being heard. And I believe that that is everything I have on ORES, and I think that we're probably almost at time, but just like last time, I am happy to stick around and answer any other questions I can. No, I was speed talking there, so if there's anything I glossed over or you have questions on, please let me know.
Well, Ian, that was a very appreciate it. I'd like a little more information on the Ag Mitigation Fund, the establishment of that. I'll email with you with my address for maybe some more information if you get that to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to provide that. I'll go to this slide so that you guys can see my email. My email's here. Yeah, I'm happy to send you anything related to anything I talked about or didn't talk about tonight. So yeah, please reach out to me. It's ian.latimer@nycerta.ny.gov. I will send you any and all ag mitigation payment information that I have.
Ian, like the last presentation, can you send us these slides?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to.
You can send them to Kelly Baccaro.
Yeah, I will do so tonight after the meeting.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does anybody else have anything for Ian?
You said you were going to develop a comprehensive plan guideline or suggestion. You said by the end of this year?
Yeah, that's my goal right now. So I've been managing a contract with a couple of land use law professors, and we're working to develop sort of the best practices for comp planning. That doesn't mean that we can't help now in the meantime, though. So, if there's specific questions, I'd be happy to sort of give you an idea of what we're looking to incorporate here and or what I've seen from other comp plans across the state and even across the country. We've done a pretty exhaustive review of suggestions for implementing clean energy and comprehensive plans. So I'm happy to send you all of that and talk to you and your colleagues on the comp plan board if you're interested.
Definitely. Thank you. We're updating ours. It's 11 years old, and we'd definitely like to speak with you on that also. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Happy to. And also, if you're not familiar as well, just to give a shout out to a sister agency, the Department of State has a division of local government services, which puts together pretty comprehensive guidelines around things like zoning and comp plans. So I think that they're, if questions that you're coming into are more about general comprehensive plans and the strategies for making sure your comp plan is taking into consideration the right stakeholders or community opinions, things like that, they have some good resources on that front. But I'm also happy to, weigh in on what we've found related to clean energy specifically, but also the professors we're working it with are experts on comp plans related to things not including clean energy. So they have some good stuff I'm happy to send.
Terrific.
Okay, any other questions before we? Mike Tucker, are you still on?
I don't know if he had to go to the planning meeting, Matt.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry.
That started at 6:30. So him and Patrice probably jumped off.
Okay, well, Ian, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks.
And we're always happy to help and provide information. And so even if it's questions not related to things that I touched on tonight, if you have other questions or you're trying to get in touch with people and maybe aren't having luck, please do consider me a resource. My favorite part of the job here, which I'm not able to do, is to do these meetings in person. I love getting to travel around the state and meet with folks, and I really do want to make sure that we can provide as much information and transparency throughout these processes as possible. So please do reach out to me. I'm happy to be of service. My personal cell is 707-292-2852. I've got texting unlimited. You can send me a text. You can give me a call. I'm happy to talk. Please do feel free to use me and NYSERDA as a resource.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ian.
Take care.
Yep, thank you.
Everybody have a good evening.
Thank you, Morel, for setting up the second meeting. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for attending. Jeannie, I'm assuming we'll be talking. I can't hear you, Jean.
She's not muted there. No.
Still nothing.
Okay.
Call us tomorrow, Jean.
Take care. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, we'll see you.